No, the last time we stopped talking at free will, we spoke about a lot of things. We spoke about consciousness, the mind-body problem, why materialism is actually not as succinct and fully defined as we really think it is. But I think let's just start off where we left off. What is free will to you? And I want you to go through each view, perhaps compatibilism, incompatibilism, determinism, let's say libertarianism, and why your views differ from whatever they are, and which view you most likely consider to be your own.
Well, you left out one, my favorite, common sense. Let's forget the fancy talk and just have a look at what we all know. Okay.
I love that. Okay.
First point, every person acts as though they believe in freedom of the will. That includes the people who deny that they have freedom of the will. Mm-hmm. They act as if they believe it. That's why they present arguments to try to show that there's no free will. No point in preventing arguments if there isn't any. If we're just automata, what's the point of presenting arguments? It's just like two thermostats intercommunicating. So they all act 100% of the time as if they believe they have free will, give reasons, and so on. Well, that's point number one. Second question is, does science have anything to tell us about this? Answer, no, nothing. Science can tell us we can deal with determinism, we can deal with randomness, but that's it. That was true in the 17th century. It's true today. So 2 points. Everyone acts 100% of the time as if they believe we have free will. You can't turn to science because it tells you nothing about it except that we can't handle it. So that leaves two possibilities. One is we're all 100% deluded. We're acting in contrary to the facts 100% of the time. Second possibility is there's something missing in human science. Okay, take your choice. Actually, if you believe there isn't any choice, then you can't take it. But the way everyone acts, they can act as if they have a choice between those alternatives. It doesn't matter much what the sophisticated theories tell us. This is essentially what we're left with. And in fact, if you look at the scientists who do study voluntary motion, there are good, they don't talk about free will. They talk about trivial things like, can I decide to lift my finger or something? And their conclusion, I think maybe we've discussed this, I don't remember, but if you go to people like Emilio Pizzi, Robert Ajamian, the major scientists who deal with this, they have a state-of-the-art review in the Journal of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, in which they go through what's been learned about controlling minimal activities, eye blink, lifting your finger. And then they say, as they put it, we'll put this fancifully. And what they say fancifully is, we've come to understand something about the puppet and the strings, but we have nothing to say about the puppeteer.
Yeah.
It's just a total mystery. That's where we're left.
I mean, it often gets me thinking about, I remember very young, not to call you old in any way, but when I was very young, I remember watching a video of you and Michel Foucault. Perhaps my French is not too great, but I remember your discussion with him, and you guys were talking about morality, and so many deep topics that I remember watching this video, enjoying it so much, because it's something you don't often see online. I mean, you mostly see politics that are badly influenced by bias and fallacies of thought, etc. You guys were talking about a lot of topics, and Foucault often talks about things like addiction, putting people into prison, etc. The topic of free will cannot escape morality. So when you talk about free will, let's say libertarianism, compatibilism, and maybe a hard incompatibilism, how do these approaches navigate morality? This is such an important topic, I think, as part of this niche.
Well, you should distinguish the questions of free will from the questions of moral responsibility. Those are different topics. I mean, they're related but distinct. Almost all the philosophical tendencies that you just mentioned almost entirely are concerned with questions of moral responsibility. They're not concerned with the question of, can I decide to lift my finger? Mm-hmm. That's the question of freedom of will. There are concerns about, if there is no freedom of will, how do we assign moral responsibility? Well, that's a question you can ask, but it's only a meaningful question for those who think there's no free will. Mm-hmm. And in my opinion, nobody has that opinion. Mm-hmm. They may say they have it, but they act as if they don't believe it. I don't really care I don't think it's interesting what people think they believe. Mm-hmm. I think what's interesting is what they do believe. Yeah. And what they do believe, you can determine from their actions. Mm. Again, it's a very striking fact that 100% of our actions, including those of people who claim they don't have free will, 100% of their actions reflect a belief, an unacknowledged belief that they do have free will. So since that's 100% of human behavior, it's kind of an interesting question why people deny what they believe, but it's a separate kind of question. Mm. And these questions of moral responsibility do arise if you acknowledge that you have freedom of choice. But that's not the domain in which the tendencies that you describe function. So I think it's kind of an...
Sorry, continue. No, sorry.
I was just saying, it seems to me an odd incongruity. Okay. If we do believe that we have free will, then these questions can arise quite seriously. If we claim, hypothetically, that there's no free will, then you get into complicated philosophical questions. But I don't personally see much point in exploring them, because they're based on a hypothetical assumption which doesn't apply.
I think the most difficult part about discussing free will for me is that there are two domains. One is the metaphysics of whether or not we do have free will or not. And then you also get the moral responsibility aspect. Now, there are a group of philosophers today, Dirk Pierboom, Greg Caruso. I mean, directly, Greg Caruso and Daniel Dennett have a book called Just Desserts, primarily based on the fact that free will has such an important aspect when it comes to how we interact with each other and what we do. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think this is relevant? Why are we talking about this?
It's an amusing discussion in your free time if you have nothing else to devote yourself to. I don't find it very interesting. I mean, there is an interesting, if you like, metaphysical question. Do we have free will? Well, again, we're left with what I said before. We always act, everyone, as if we have free will. Science tells us nothing about it. Then we can make a choice. Maybe human science just has its limits, which I think there's every reason to believe. I think we are organisms. We're not angels. If we're organisms, we are like other organisms. Every single one has scope and limits. And that's true for all of our capacities as well. People question that only for our mental capacities. I don't see why those should be different from any other capacities. In the case of every other organism, their cognitive capacities has scope and limits. In the case of humans, metaphorically speaking, below the neck, meaning everyone agrees, yes, we have scope and limits. There are those who claim, in fact, it's a huge number, maybe most philosophers, that up here something escapes the natural world. It's a kind of methodological dualism, which I see no reason to accept. It seems to me much more pernicious than traditional metaphysical dualism, which was, in fact, normal science. Take a look at Descartes. It was simply normal science. Instead, he tried to argue that everything in the world has a mechanical explanation, including most things about human beings. But then he noticed, correctly, in fact, that there are certain aspects of ordinary human life which don't have a mechanical interpretation. For me, particularly interesting is that one of the main ones in the discourse is just what you and I are now doing, the ability to carry out normal conversation with others, creative, making up new expressions, new thoughts, maybe never occurred in the history of the world, and able to allow others to comprehend the inner workings of our minds by means of verbal communication. And so he argued that that's beyond the bounds of mechanical explanation, and therefore, like any good scientist, postulated a new principle in his metaphysics, a new substance, res cogitans. Well, it turned out he was wrong. Turns out there isn't a mechanical explanation for anything. So, in particular, not for normal verbal interaction. Well, that left us, that's Newton, basically, showed there's no mechanical explanations for anything in the world. He regarded that as a complete absurdity, but he was stuck with it. Then, very quickly, within a couple of years, in fact, came John Locke, who said, yes, Mr. Newton has demonstrated to us that what we call the material world has properties we can't comprehend. It's just a fact. So maybe organized matter, whatever matter turns out to be, has the property of generating thought. Yeah, that's, I think, the answer to the question. Don't think it's been improved on since. So that's what we're left with. We have scope and limits, like everything else in the organic world. And it may be that the explanation for the freedom of will that all of us act as if we believe we have, maybe it's just beyond human cognitive capacities. If so, it wouldn't be unique.
Now, if you had to define free will versus, let's say, agency or choice as a linguist, I mean, as one of the most influential linguists on the planet, how would you differentiate these three words? Like agency, free will, and freedom of choice, I guess.
I think they're the same. Free will means free agency. Free agency means free will.
Okay.
I don't see a difference between them.
I have so many questions for you. What I'm going to do is, because the first podcast got so much engagement, I've got a lot of questions for you from the viewers and the listeners. So let me start with the first one. The one is from Dean. He says, Professor Chomsky, in 2012, you once had an interview with Peter Hallward. And would Professor Chomsky comment on Spinoza's philosophy of mind? And what did he mean by saying to Peter Hallward, and I quote, putting aside considerations of Spinoza's subtle ideas, question mark, and end quote. Is Spinoza's work still relevant and of any value today? And was Spinoza then going into the right direction, let's say closer to the truth per se?
Spinoza was a brilliant, innovative thinker. It's very intriguing to try to understand what he was saying. My own personal opinion is that the arguments he presented, while challenging and intriguing, don't hold up. So if you run through the quasi-axiomatic system in the ethics, say, it's kind of interesting to see how his mind is working, but I don't think the arguments hold up.
Okay. Let's move on to the next one. Right. This is about intellectual freedom. Please ask, why does Professor Chomsky believe... Oh, wait, sorry. The question is, why do so many linguists disagree with Chomsky? And why is behaviorism so popular? First of all, I don't agree with that. Most linguists disagree with you, but I'm just going with the questions.
No, I think it's correct. My own conception of what the study of language is about is shared by very few others, including the department that I helped found and have taught in most of my life. I do give talks there. People listen with interest, but they don't look at linguistics this way. That's actually been true all my life. It's always been a small minority. Okay, that's the way it is. I just see the field differently. On the other hand, if you look at the tradition, which goes back 2,500 years, I pretty much fall within the tradition up until the 20th century. From classical Greece, classical India, up through the early 20th century, language was understood as basically the same as thought. In fact, language was described by simply audible thought. We know audible isn't too narrow, could be visual, any sensory motor system. But the basic idea was that language is the generator of thought, and thought is what is generated by language. That was the standard view for millennia. Early 20th century, it changed. Early 20th century came the behaviorist structuralist period, which broke quite sharply from this. My own work beginning mid-20th century, which was could take a major step forward thanks to developments in mathematics, the development of the mathematical theory of computation, Alan Turing, Kurt Gödel, others. That made it possible for the first time to make a clear and sharp distinction between something that Aristotle had brought up but nobody knew what to do with. That is the distinction between possession of knowledge and use of knowledge. So if you look at the whole tradition, say Descartes or Galileo or others who puzzled about this, they were always talking about production. How do we produce thought? Always. No discussion of what is thought, because that requires the distinction between generation and production, which are two quite different things. Possession of knowledge in Aristotle's sense is generation of an infinite number of thoughts. Here's the array of thoughts that are possible for human beings. Production is a much more complex thing. It means selecting something. When I speak to you, I am somehow selecting something out of that infinite array and then going through the procedure of implementing it. The first part, we're back in a total mystery, the mystery of how you make choices. And nobody has anything to say about that. But at least we can now make the distinction, and we can study the generation and the nature of thoughts, saying, here they are, here are the thoughts. Then we can turn to the question of, with production, there's two questions. How do I select something out of that array? Total mystery. How do I implement what I've selected? Yes, we can study that. That's the problem of implementation of production. It's kind of an input-output problem. So yeah, we can deal with it. Just as we can deal with perception. It's an input-output question. So you hear a sound, you carry out mechanical manipulations, and it leads to one of the thoughts. Those are topics we can deal with. But there's a big mystery right in the middle. How do we go from the generation of thoughts, which we can study and learn a lot about? What's the nature of thought? A lot of progress on that. But to move from that to how we select one, what I'm doing, what you're doing, that remains total mystery, as much of a mystery as lifting my finger. And that's where we now stand. Well, that's a view of linguistics that very few linguists accept. They're interested in production and perception. Okay, I am interested in the tradition of 2.5 millennia. I think it was on the right track. And the gap that they couldn't deal with, generation of thought, we now can deal with. We can learn quite a lot about it, about the nature of thought and the nature of language. And I think we found a lot about that. But it's just not the main interest of most linguists or cognitive scientists or philosophers. The philosophers totally refuse to look in it. So you take the leading philosophers of the 20th century, philosophers of language, say Quine, probably the most influential, the one I knew quite well, studying with him. We never agreed on this. For him, language is, as he put it, a complex of dispositions to respond, period. Leonard Bloomfield, the great theoretician of modern structural linguistics, language is a matter, as he put it, of habit and training. That's all. Training by some sort of reinforcement procedure. It's totally untenable. It's nothing like that. De Saussure basically said nothing about it. Said language is a social contract of some kind. European structuralism doesn't discuss the question. But notice that in the long sweep of history, there's a gap. The gap is early 20th century behaviorism and structuralism, which just put these questions aside. Picking up in mid-20th century, now informed by the mathematical theory of computation, we can look at the gap in the tradition and reconstitute the tradition in modern terms while recognizing that there is a gap that we don't know how to fulfill, namely how to choose out of the infinite set. I mean, that's not something, it's something familiar in other areas. So take mathematics. Suppose you have a formalized theory of arithmetic, say Peano's formalization of arithmetic. The formalization is generative. It says, here is the infinite number of possible proofs. Peano's axioms can be regarded as a generative system which generates the infinitely many possible proofs. the proof, each proof is a kind of a geometrical object, if you look at it formally. What does a mathematician do who's trying to prove something? Doesn't run through the axiom system. How he does it is totally mysterious. No mathematician can tell you. It's just some creative act, you know. Well, that's what we're doing every moment of the day, instantaneously. We're instantaneously picking something out of the array of possible thoughts and implementing it. Galileo was quite right in regarding this as one of the most amazing things in the world. He couldn't go much beyond that, but he was right to be amazed by it. Descartes was right in postulating some new substance to try to deal with it. But it remains as much of a mystery as it was for Galileo and the scientists of the early 17th century scientific revolution who were deeply puzzled by this. Galileo himself regarded the alphabet as the most spectacular of human inventions because it was able somehow to represent this, not answer the question, but at least to represent it. This astonishing mystery of how, with a finite number of symbols, which is all we have, maybe large but finite, we are somehow able to construct infinitely many thoughts and even to convey to others the inner workings of our mind, though they don't have access to it. He regarded this as an invention unique in human history. But that's as much a mystery to us as it was to the scientists of the early 17th century.
Noam, you mentioned Quine, and I think it's important. Like Quine once mentioned, I'm going to paraphrase, but he mentioned that we've spent so much time studying the typical, yet if we had spent more time studying the atypical, let's say madness in quotes, we could learn a lot more about the human mind. So Quine once said something along these lines. I can't remember the exact quote. It was part of my textbook in my master's, and it's a while back. But along those lines, there's people like J.L. Austin from Oxford. If you think about the way their philosophy works, and you talk about language and words, the choice of words we use. Because I am fascinated by mental health and how we construct diagnoses, how the ICD or the DSM form. What are your thoughts on these? I mean, the fact that we now give terms or terminologies to certain scopes of experience, because clearly, well, from my perspective, there's a spectrum, and yet we somehow find ways to give definitions along the line. What are your thoughts on that? J.L. Austin, I mean, he describes it very well with his Oxford philosophy. But yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, John Austin, I happen to know pretty well in the 1950s. He visited Harvard repeatedly, and we got to be quite friendly. Started when I was a graduate student there and continued, actually almost until his death. I met him weeks before he died. He was working at the time on a theory of language, detailed theory of language, which, in my opinion, was on the wrong track, but it was interesting. He was a very smart guy. I don't think he left anything published about this, and his literary executors seem to have left it out, as far as I can see. But he was developing a theory of language based essentially on sound symbol correlation. So he was a very learned philologist. Philology was one of his main interests. And he was interested in questions like, for example, if you take the English words glamour, G-L, and grammar, G-R, they have the same origin, but they went in different directions. and he wanted to relate this to the sound symbolism. He pointed out it's well known that if you look at the English vocabulary, GL appears in lots of words that have some vague kind of semantic similarity, like glare, glimmer, gleam, and so on. A lot of them have. And he thought that was quite significant. Most others think it's kind of an accident. But he wanted to try to develop a theory based essentially on this primitive observation and expanding it. Personally, I don't think they would have gotten very far, but everything Boston did was quite interesting, had a very intriguing mind. Well, as far as I know, this has been left out of his posthumous public record. I haven't seen any reference to it, even though he was teaching courses on this in his last semester at Oxford. It seems to be gone. But he was one of the people I could talk to about these things. He didn't agree, but we could discuss it. With the philosophers at Harvard, impossible, or the linguists.
Yeah. So along that line, I mean, because Joel Osteen, he spoke a lot about, for example, I remember, I think it was the Oxford Handbook of Philosophy and Psychiatry, or the Oxford Textbook of Philosophy and Psychiatry. I apologize if I'm wrong to anyone who's listening, but he mentions a chair, for example. When you ask someone what is a chair, people define it very differently. Some people think of it as something that you sit on. Some people think of something with 4 legs, or something with a backrest. So when you ask someone what is depression, it's very difficult for you to now try and vocabularize an experience that's so diverse. What are your thoughts on mental illness and the way we describe these things or these terms?
Well, I happen to be a very simple-minded person. I like to pay attention to the simple things, like what's a chair? What's mental depression? I don't think we can say anything about that. But if we ask what's a chair, that turns out to open very interesting questions. Like take what you just said. Some people say it's something with a back, something with legs. And notice that gets back to a point that Aristotle raised, a very significant point, which has been mostly forgotten. His example was house, but could have been chair. He said if we want to define a house, incidentally, he was talking in metaphysical terms. What is a house? But you can easily translate that into cognitive terms, which for him were about the same, because he saw basically no difference between the thing and the word for the thing. The word for the thing is just a reflection of the thing, so they're about the same. So let's talk about the meaning of house, not what is a house. Well, Aristotle pointed out that it has 2 components. In his metaphysics, it was form and matter. So the matter of a house is the bricks, the timbers, and so on that a physicist could identify. The form of a house is the intention of the designer, the characteristic use, mental things, something a physicist couldn't find looking at a house. And I think he's quite right. So something could look exactly like a house, but not be a house, because it was intended for some other purpose, maybe a library, a stable for horses, maybe something else. Well, that tells you something very, same with chair. You can look at a chair for us, for people. A chair is something that is characterized by the fact that we use it in certain ways. Wittgenstein pointed out once that if a chair started to speak, we wouldn't know what it is, because a chair has to have certain formal properties in Aristotle's sense. That's a very significant fact, because it raises the question, how does an infant know this? How does an infant know all of this very complex set of properties? And it does become very complex when you begin to explore it. How does an infant know that? Well, we now have experimental work, mainly by Lila Gleitman, late cognitive scientist, which showed that children acquire the meaning of a word with very few presentations. 2 or 3 presentations, they know the whole meaning of the word. How? How do they know? I mean, you ask Quine, Wittgenstein, others, it's association, can't be. No associations could give you the fact that Aristotle noticed, that the nature of an object and of the meaning of a word is something that can't be detected from its physical properties. No possible learning theory can get you that. So it's another one of those mysteries. It's something about how we're designed. Humans are somehow designed so that our concepts, all of them, the simplest ones like chair, are very intricate constructions based on properties that cannot be identified in the physical object. Well, one thing that means is that, contrary to widespread belief, there is no notion of reference in human language. But the things that we do carry out, the actions of referring, as John Austin pointed out, Peter Strauss and other Oxford ordinary language philosophers in the 1950s. We do carry out actions of referring, but it doesn't follow that the language has a relation of reference. It doesn't. There are no extra mental objects that the words of our language refer to. There are internal mental objects which we use in the action of referring. That's something different. That means language has no semantics in the sense of Frege, Tarski, Carnap, Quine, and others, just doesn't have semantics. Incidentally, that wouldn't have bothered Frege or Tarski or Carnap because they didn't see any point in studying language anyway. It's just maybe a useful way of getting examples. But Carnap, who I knew pretty well, didn't even understand why people speak ordinary language. Why don't they speak formal languages where everything's well defined? But so this conclusion wouldn't have bothered them, but it should bother all the people who think that language has a relation, or that it has a notion of truth, or that you can do model theoretic semantics, or all of those people should be concerned with this. That's practically all of philosophy of language and all of what's called formal semantics. And it doesn't bother them because they're not really interested in these issues. They're just practical concerns of let's make it work better. Well, as I said, that's a departure from 2,500 years of tradition. In my view, regression of structuralism and behaviorism. You asked before why everyone is attracted by this. Well, there's an interesting study which may provide the answer. There's a very good cognitive scientist at Northeastern University in Boston, I forgot, Iris Berent, B-E-R-E-N-T. She's done very interesting studies on many topics. And one of them leads to the conclusion that we are sort of innately behaviorist. That is, if you just look at people's common sense attitudes, they tend to give empiricists, she said, tend to give radical empiricist answers. It's kind of like a natural intuition, just like infants are automatically accept the mechanical philosophy. So if you do experiment, this is done 60 years ago by Michaud, if you give infants a presentation kind of like this, two things moving in a fixed relationship, they'll automatically assume that there's an invisible barrier connecting them, because otherwise it couldn't be happening. Well, that's the mechanical philosophy, which was disproven by Newton, but it's part of our intuition, which is probably why it was fixed upon in the first place. And empiricism seems to be the same. You kind of automatically try to give empiricist answers. When they're refuted, you sometimes hang on to them anyway. That's, I think, a disease of philosophy and linguistics. I should say that Austin, Strawson, and others were not subject to this. They broke out of it. They did recognize, Austin famously, that words, language generally, are something you do things with. That's the production side. It's not the internal side, which he was interested in, but had nothing to say about.
There's so many things to touch on there that I actually have to think about which part I actually really want to go down. But as someone who's intrigued by the mental health aspect of this topic, do you think we look, this is not a political podcast, and I try my best to avoid politics as much because I want this to be philosophical, very metaphysical as much as possible as well. But do you think that the way social media, the way we chat nowadays, our lack of the use of the English language, because we obviously have shortened many terms, many words, do you think all of this plays a role into the way we are medicalizing mental illness? Or do you think mental illness is rising, or are we just medicalizing human experiences?
Well, I think that this is not an area that I know very well, I should say, but it's an interesting one. I've certainly been interested, looked into it. Psychiatry has moved extensively towards treatment by pharmaceutical means and others. That probably makes reasonably good sense in many areas. There are significant advances made in treating many Parkinson's, for example, by medical means. I mean, at my age, I have the few friends that are still alive, and in their last years, many did have mental diseases like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and so on. And they were treated effectively, especially Parkinson's, medically. It did maintain their lives, productive, happy lives, well beyond would have been possible 50 years earlier. So I don't disparage this at all. I think lots of good can be done. Probably there is over-medicalization. There's a natural tendency. If you have a hammer, you look for nails, famous idiom. You have pharmaceutical means, you try to apply them. It's probably also true of surgery. And there's good evidence that surgery is overused, that many, I'll just tell you a personal thing back about 40 years
in
ago,
medicine, we often say ourselves, surgeons cut. That's just what they do. They see something, they cut it. That's what I
won't skip the personal part, but it's common. It's well known in the medical profession, say cardiologists, that there's pressures in the hospitals to treat things surgically for several reasons. One, it's because we know how to do. Another, it's very lucrative for the hospitals. They make a lot of money on it. If you can treat a heart disease by medication or by telling people to change their lifestyles, they're not going to make any money. So there's a lot of pressure on cardiologists to go for the knife for several reasons, some good, some not good. I personally happen to have been benefited from this. I might say that 40 years ago, and I'm pressing 94, so when I was in my 50s, 60s, I
hope
started having heart problems and
I'm
my own heart.
cognitively. I hope when I'm 94, I'm as cognitively as engaged as you, because it's amazing. Like it's
And
all.
I happen to have a cardiologist who was a personal friend and, in fact, a leading figure in the field, who was kind of isolated in the field because he believed in putting off surgical intrusion until the very end if there was no other possibility. And some cardiologists did suggest surgical treatment, and I went to talk to him, and he said, don't bother with it. We can handle it just by mild medication and some obvious lifestyle changes. It's worked perfectly. Never had any medical intervention. Still taking a lot of pills, but that's easy. Anyhow, I think that's pretty common. And you can see the reasons. And I think the same is true of psychiatric treatment. It has successes. If it's used intelligently, it can be effective. I've seen personal cases, read of others, but it can easily, there's a temptation to overuse it, to treat everything with drugs where other things are necessary. Partly this is something, here we're getting into politics, I'm afraid, but the whole medical system has been subjected to the neoliberal assault on human beings, turn everything into market-based commercial applications. I mean, I can tell you cases that I know very well, and there are many others, where somebody goes to a doctor and it has to be done in 15 minutes. If it takes more than 15 minutes, a supervisor comes in and tells the doctor, sorry, you got to stop, because we have to be maximally efficient. We have to meet market conditions. The worst possible medication means the doctor can't get to know you, to figure out what your life is like, what your problems are, think about the way a traditional doctor used to do. The doctor was kind of like a personal friend, got to know you and so on. Can't do that. Have to do it in 15 minutes because that's the way you're efficient. A lot of life has been marketized that way, and it's very destructive. We see it in all sorts of things. Turn to another domain. Suppose you got a bank statement and it looks wrong, looks like there's an error in it. So you want to get in touch with the bank to see if they can fix it. Well, you know what happens. You call the bank, you get a recorded message which says, we love you, just stay on the line. And then some music starts playing, and every once in a while you get a recorded voice. And after you've spent 45 minutes, finally a recorded voice comes along and says, do you want to speak to a person? And you say, yes, I'd like to speak to a person. And finally you get to speak to a person, and they say, oh, sorry, this is the wrong number, call that number.
Wrong
and then you go on. Well, economists tell you that's very efficient. By economists' measures, it's efficient. It means the company doesn't spend any money, doesn't cost them anything, costs you something, but economists don't count that. That's not part of economic theory. If you waste 2 hours, your problem, we don't count that. So it's very efficient, but very destructive of life. If the bank would hire a few more people, you could have saved 45 minutes. They would have had an extra person to pay. Well, according to economic theory, that's not efficient, because economic theory and its political implementation and neoliberalism just makes our lives harsher, more brutal, same in the medical profession, but it saves money. So therefore it's fine. That's why the rich are getting super rich and everyone else is staying poor. Yeah. I'm sorry, we're getting into politics, but politics is pervasive.
When
that's affecting the medical profession as well.
It's very difficult not to get into politics when you have a philosophy podcast. So I don't think there's a need to apologize. But on that topic, exactly what you're talking about, I think it aligns well. While we spoke about free will, and now we're talking about the way people use the internet, social media, etc. How are people's free wills being challenged or controlled because of the way economists, businessmen, um, social media enthusiasts and marketers and marketing people control us? Because clearly that's a way to control free will in a way, is we don't have as much control as we used to be. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, we can go back to my favorite philosopher, David Hume.
I love David Hume.
50 years ago, he wrote the first major work in what we now call political science or political philosophy. It was called First Principles of Government. If you open it, the first paragraph says something like this. He says it more eloquently, but this is basically it. He said, I'm amazed by the easiness with which the many submit themselves to the few. Power is in the hands of the governed, those who are governed, but they don't use it. They submit themselves to the power of the few. And he says, how can this miracle come about? He says, well, it has to be what we now call manufacture of consent, imposition of consent. Somehow people are induced to consent to rule by the masters, though they don't have to be. They could take power themselves. So the main principle of government is how to control people so that they don't use the power that they have. Well, I think that's right on target. That's how the few manage to keep control and to master us. And there are massive industries devoted to this. They are so common we don't even pay attention to them. Like take the advertising industry. Hundreds of billions of dollars are spent every year to try to induce you to do things which are harmful to you and destructive to the world, namely to become a mad dog consumer. Literally, hundreds of billions of dollars a year are spent to do this from infancy. There are now fields of applied psychology, literally, which study how to get children to nag their parents. Well, literally, 50 years ago, the advertising industry realized that there's a big group of people who they aren't targeting, children. And they said, we've ignored them because children don't have money. But we've overlooked the fact that children can nag their parents and get them to get things from them. That was a big insight. So now if you watch television with your children, me, my great-grandchildren, if you watch television with them, 2-year-olds, full of advertising, here's something you have to have, a $400 talking dog or something. So get your mother to buy it for you. That starts from infancy. And the mother gets irritated, buys it, kid looks at it and throws it away, get the next thing. Well, that's very profitable. It's destructive of our lives, destructive of the environment, but it's a way to make money. That's David Hume, led to a huge effort. I mean, I'll give you a personal anecdote again. First time I went to a baseball game was in 1937. Kids were interested in the baseball players, what was happening, and so on. I didn't go for many years until one of my grandchildren wanted me to take him to a baseball game. I took him. Advertising everywhere. The walls are covered with advertising. The baseball uniforms of the players have ads on the back. The game has to stop every once in a while for advertising for television. I mean, every aspect of life has been overwhelmed by the effort to make you a totally irrational consumer. It's hard to get away from it. By now, people just regard it as like the air you breathe. You don't ask about it. But it's a massive technique of controlling you, and it covers everything else, up to the media and teaching and all sorts of things. It's part of it's become, in the last 40 years, the neoliberal years, when economists have had a big impact and aligned very closely with the needs of the business world, it's been overwhelming. The effect on the public has been devastating. What it's led to is a mood of anger, disillusionment, contempt for institutions, which is all over the place, very destructive, basically leading to a kind of neo-fascist tendencies in government. So it's no small matter.
No.
But David Hume basically had it right.
Exactly. I mean, Manufacturing Consent was one of the first books of yours that I did read. I've read dozens afterwards. I mean, you are an excellent writer, but I'll never forget the feeling I had when I read Manufacturing Consent. It changed the way I perceived everything. You get almost this. It's almost like reading 1984. It's got this Big Brother feel to it, where you're being controlled.
For good reasons.
Yeah, exactly. But
reasons.
my question to you is, how then do you believe that we have sort of a free will when clearly we can't control this, when it is controlled by others? How are we able to navigate this dichotomy?
For us, it's quite easy. If you and I were living in Russia or China, wouldn't be easy. If we were carrying out this conversation in Russia, let's say, you could expect the secret police to come in and drag us off to a concentration camp. Okay, same in China. Not here, not for you, not for me. So we live in highly controlled societies, but we have a lot of freedom. It didn't come by magic. You can tell where you live what a struggle it was to attain it. Well, not that significant much here in the United States, but pretty hard. People, about a century ago, Eugene Debs was tossed into jail for daring to say the kinds of things that I say now about what wars, that wars the health of the state, that's the United States. It's been a battle here too, but nothing like other places. But it's been won. A lot of freedom's been won, which means we have the opportunity to tear aside the very thin veil of propaganda control. We can do it and break through. You read the newspapers, a lot of what they say is quite valuable and important. You have to know how to navigate your way through the means of control and marginalization that are built in for institutional reasons, but it's not that difficult. It's not quantum physics. You can do it pretty easily, help other people do it. You mentioned social media. It could be something liberating, ways for people to explore, learn, interact. Unfortunately, it hasn't been that way. Most of what it does is isolate people in small, self-reinforcing bubbles. You kind of naturally gravitate towards things that you approve of and where you get approved. And then attitudes get solidified. You don't hear alternatives. You lose empathy, the ability to think openly. It's been destructive. I mean, doesn't have to be like that. Can break out of that, but it takes exercise of the free will that fortunately we have.
Now, I have so many more questions for you. My question for you is, there are still some questions from the audience that I have for you. Do you have time to answer a few of them?
Let's go along a little bit longer.
Let's go for some of them. Let's see. Right. So the one says, okay, this is quite a long one. It says, hello, Professor Chomsky. I've been confused about Professor Chomsky's insistence about Newton's destruction of the mechanical philosophy, which, if I understand correctly, is based on a reintroduction of an occult force, namely gravity, to explain the motion of bodies. I thought that Einstein's theory of relativity explained this by supposing bodies move according to the easiest geometry in their region of space-time, conceptually similar to a ball on an incline except non-Euclidean, not because of an action at a distance. So if this is true, then why totally abandon the traditional Cartesian dualism if maybe like gravity, things can be explained mechanically after some time? That's quite a long one. I'm sorry about that.
Okay. That's a very common error, including leading physicists who don't understand what the issue was about the mechanical philosophy. Newton showed that the mechanical philosophy didn't work. There is no material world that conforms to the mechanical philosophy. Newton regarded this an absurdity, so did Leibniz, Huygens, the other great physicists of the day. And in fact, and they were correct. What happened is that the idea, the hope to develop an intelligible world disappeared. Science changed its goals, lowered them, didn't care anymore about whether you have an intelligible world, just whether you have intelligible theories of the world. That's a big difference. So Newton's theories were perfectly intelligible. Leibniz could understand them perfectly well. Newton understood them, but they weren't what Newton called a physical theory, one that explained the world in intelligible terms. Einstein's theory is intelligible, the theory, but not the world it describes. It's in a total abandonment of the mechanical, of any notion of intelligibility of the world, given it all up. So it's like Newton's theory. Yes, the theory is intelligible, but it doesn't bear on the questions that the great scientists who founded modern science were concerned with. We've given that up. Nobody tries anymore. In fact, when you get to, say, Bertrand Russell, who knew the sciences well, he said the search for intelligibility is ridiculous. Put it aside. Took a long time for this to settle in, but now it's just become scientific common sense. We just abandon the goals of the scientific revolution. Galileo, Newton, Leibniz, other great figures. We abandon their hopes. We just lower our sights to try to develop intelligible theories. Newton's was intelligible, but not quite right. Einstein's is intelligible, does a little better, but it all abandons the aspirations that led to modern science, given all those up. So yes, there's no longer any body-mind problem because there's no body. Okay, we don't care. All we need is an intelligent, like Locke pointed out. Let's try to do, in the wake of Newton, let's try to find a intelligible theory of how mental actions take place. We've abandoned any hope of trying to find out what matter is. So Newton himself said, we know so little about matter that for all we know, all matter is alive. Arthur Eddington, a century ago, went beyond that. He said that we know so little about matter that for all we know, all matter is conscious, like atoms. We don't know that they're not conscious because we don't know anything about matter. Well, same with Einstein's theory. Yes, the theory is quite intelligible. You can teach it to students, they understand it, but it has abandoned the hopes and the aspirations that animated modern science. Those have been given up. This was actually understood by 19th century historians of science like Friedrich Lange. Take a look at his great book on materialism. He points out that modern materialists have simply abandoned traditional materialism. They're willing to accept notions like force and field and so on, which they understand, but have no material basis, because we've given that up. Well, that was mid-19th century. We should be able to understand it today. Science just abandoned the goals of the scientific revolution. Very important moment in the history of science. Took some time to sink in. So if you take a look at Newton, he himself said, look, I can't give a physical explanation for anything. His famous comment, I do not make hypotheses, was in that context. He said, I'm sorry, I have no hypothesis about science. That's why his major work is called Mathematical Principles. It's not called Principles of Philosophy. Philosophy meant science in those days. It took a long time. Even at Cambridge University, his own university, they didn't teach Newton's theories for about, I think, 50 years, because they weren't physical theories. They were just mathematics. And so it's not science. And finally, science just abandoned hope. Said, we're not interested in this anymore. We have lower goals. Okay, probably the right move. But there's no longer any dualism, because there's no body, no matter. The same is true of consciousness. The discussion of consciousness is very misleading. There's a fine philosopher, young philosopher, Galen Strawson, Peter Strawson's son, who's written extensively about this, and I think he's right. He's pointed out that the whole contemporary discussion about consciousness is completely backwards. It's not, there's no problem of consciousness. Consciousness we understand better than anything else. We have a perfect understanding of consciousness. I can describe in detail what my consciousness is, so can you. What we don't understand is matter. So we don't understand the relation between consciousness and matter because we don't know what matter is. As Arthur Eddington put it, for all we know, all matter is a lie. It's conscious. Actually, Strawson himself pursues this, tries to develop the panpsychism. I don't agree with him in that, but I think his basic observation is correct. Bertrand Russell said the same thing a century ago. He said, what we know best is consciousness, better than anything else. That's what we're most confident about, what we know most about. The rest of our intellectual explorations are attempts to ground this in something. And there we run into trouble because we don't know what matter is. That's basically correct, I think. So in my opinion, we can put all the literature, sorry.
I was chatting to Galen. We're going to chat very soon about the mind-body problem, consciousness, etc. And Philip Goff possibly, I think next week, I have an interview with him. So the panpsychism debate's going to start. We're going to chat about that in quite a bit of detail. Before we get there, I mean, well, as we conclude, just want to, this is the final question from one of the last listeners. They want to know from you, Noam, what are your secular metaphysics in terms of teleology? What do you really believe is the point of all of this? Why are we here? What is the purpose of all of this? This is one of the questions, the last one I have for you from the listeners.
The purpose of life, the meaning of life, is what we give to it, period. Other than that, has no purpose.
So
our lives have
type of
no more purpose than the lives of the trees in my backyard. We have the opportunity, which the trees don't have, to make something of our lives. And that will be their meaning and purpose. what we choose to do with this opportunity to have a number of years on Earth. What do we do with it? That's the meaning of life. You're not going to find it anywhere else.
I love that. Look, I know as this is something I always do, and I didn't get the chance the last time. We had a lot of technical errors and a lot of difficulties, but who, if you had to give me your Mount Rushmore of philosophy or science, combine them, perhaps give us 5 at least, who are the people you suggest we read, try to get a deeper understanding of not only philosophy, but the nature of reality, science, and the universe? If you had to give us 5 people you'd recommend, and these are the people that inspired you most, who would they be?
Actually, the people I've found most inspiring over the years, like Russell or Hume, are people who worked out pretty clearly or articulated pretty clearly things I had mostly pretty much figured out by myself. We bring to philosophy our own understanding, our questions, our confusions. Sometimes people help us clear them up, but there's no list you can point to. Could be anyone. Could be Heraclitus. He asked a profound question. How can we cross the same river twice? It's a very profound question. When you stop to think of it, raises all kinds of questions. Well, that was pre-Socratic, so we can start there. Or we can look at the Delphic Oracle, know thyself. It's good advice. Try to figure out what kind of person are you, what kind of creatures are we, and so on. So let's start with that. You get from philosophy what you bring to it. What are the kinds of questions and concerns that you have tried to think about for yourself, come to some conclusions, maybe wrong, maybe incoherent. Maybe you can find someone who, as Wittgenstein put it, can help the fly out of the fly bottle. That's what you should be looking for.
If you had to name your Mount Rushmore philosophy, who would they be? I know it's a tough question. It's putting you on the spot, but I know Hume's definitely up there. If you had to add 3 more people to that list, who would they be?
Too many people. In fact, some of them would be people you never heard of.
It's fine.
People who barely even went to school. Literally. I mean, one of the most influential people in my life, personally, happened to be an uncle who never went past 4th grade, but was one of the best educated people I've ever met in my life.
I love
Actually, was a lay analyst, profound insight into people, political world, science, other things. Literally never went past 4th grade. That's what you find difficult.
What is his name? I mean, I'd love to know his name.
His name was Milton Krauss. Died many years ago.
Krauss is one of the people who made Noam Chomsky the man he is today. It's great to know that. 2 more names, at least. David, look, personally, David Hume's one of my favorite of all time.
David Hume is
and I love
one of my favorites. He realized in one of the most tragic submissions in the history of philosophy, at the end of his life, he did publish a kind of an afterword to a new publication of the treatise, in which he said everything he had tried to do all of his life was a failure.
Yeah.
Actually, Galileo said the same thing. Near the end of his life, he said, I was hoping to show that the world is intelligible. It's a total failure. He said, I cannot find an intelligible explanation of the tides, which was true. You can't in the mechanical philosophy. And in fact, I think you find other moments in the history of philosophy and science where people have asked hard, serious questions and at the end said, it all failed, you know. But they left us with insights and questions, like those I've mentioned.
Yeah. No, this is, I mean, the podcast is called Mind Body Solution, obviously searching for the answer to the mind body problem. Your final words on the mind body problem and what you think we should do about it. Should we care about it? How can we go about solving this problem? How should we end this conversation?
The first step we should take is asking, is there a mind body problem? You have to ask that question before you try to solve it. And the answer to that question is no. There is no mind body problem. There has been none since Isaac Newton, as John Locke recognized, because we do not have a concept of body. Body, matter, physical, and so on. It's just whatever there is. If you look at modern physics, they don't know. You can read, in fact, I just recently did read a debate in a quantum physics journal that a friend sent me, which is half a dozen leading quantum physicists debating the question, what is a particle? They don't know. A number of different answers, speculations. Nobody knows. We don't know what matter is. So there's no mind-body problem. So therefore, there's no solution to it. The nearest you can come to a solution is Locke's suggestion. Repeated. He put it in his theological framework, but we can drop the theology. The way he put it, he said right after about a year or so after Newton's Principia appeared, he said something like this, just as the incomparable Mr. Newton has shown that God assigned to matter properties that we cannot comprehend, so God might have superadded to matter the property of thought, meaning some organized forms of matter, whatever matter is, yield thought. Right through the 18th century, that was pursued seriously by Hume, many others, Lemaitre, finally Joseph Priestley, scientist, philosopher, who worked on it extensively, finds its way into Darwin's early notebooks, then pretty much forgotten, reinvented in the late 20th century as what Francis Crick called an astonishing hypothesis, what the Churchlands called a radical new idea in history of philosophy, and basically just repeating Locke's suggestion in the same words, often repeating Priestley. I mean, it's useful to study the history of philosophy. There are a lot of insights which have been forgotten. I mentioned the millennia-old history of linguistics, which was forgotten in the structuralist behaviorist period, but should be revived. But you don't find answers. You find questions that need answers,
Yes.
and that inspire us to look into them. But with the mind-body problem, there's not going to be a solution because there's no problem in the first place.
No, as we end this off, I remember one of the comments in our last conversation was, great to see Noam no longer chatting about politics and Ukraine. Look, I believe it's very important that you should be, and I'm glad you are doing that. But the comment followed on by saying, it's so great to see him talking about philosophy, metaphysics, etc. So my last question to you is, why should we be doing this? Why is philosophy important? Why should people be asking the deeper questions about the reality of nature, the world, or the mind?
Go back to the Delphic Oracle 2,500 years ago. First question we should be asking is, know thyself. Move on to Socrates. A couple of years later, an unexamined life is not worth living. Once we get that far, we can say, at every infant wants to understand how the world works. Any parent knows that children are annoying because they keep asking why. I want to understand that. A lot of education, treatment of children is designed to beat that curiosity out of their heads. So let's recover the infancy and try to understand ourselves, try to understand the world. There's nothing that we can think of that's more important, including its applications. So I think the question has easy answers.
Thank you so much, Noam. I honestly enjoy and relish this time with you. I hope we get to do it again sometime. How are you feeling? Any final words from your side?
Nothing more.
I really appreciate your time. Thanks so much, Noam, for joining me one more time.
Very good to be with you. Enjoy talking to you.